First advanced plans meeting of 2023. Let me go ahead. Pardon?
So when did you lose control there?
Okay, it's now 10 o'clock by our new accurate clock. So I'll take a roll call. Dual here. Warren. Joe Johnson.
Here.
Fox.
Here.
Hartman.
Here.
Miles is not here. McKay.
Here.
Okay. So I guess we will go ahead and start with the agenda. And the first item on the agenda is approval of the previous meeting minutes.
Second.
Okay. Approved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign.
Okay.
Okay. So we have what? 5, 6, 5 a yes and 1 abstaining.
That's correct.
Okay. So now we will move on to the first item on the agenda. We have Professor Stan Longhofer with Wichita State University with us today to talk about housing trends and forecasts and interest rates, affordable housing, and other interesting things.
And I'd
Thanks
just
for
like to
joining
add
us.
that Professor Longhofer is obviously professor, but he's also the chair of the real estate and finance chair at Wichita State and the Wichita State Center for Real Estate. So he's agreed to join us today and talk about the topics that Commissioner Duell just mentioned.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I know that I need to stay here at the podium because of the recording, and those of you who are remote, hi, Joe. But I normally like to walk around, and I really prefer if we have a discussion and a conversation. So please feel free to interrupt me at any time, ask questions, challenge me. I find I learn a lot from these things. Many of you know that every year at the Center for Real Estate, we do an annual housing market forecast, and we put all that together starting in August and early September every year, and we release it in early October. And this year obviously has been some of the most tumultuous times in terms of changes that have happened over that time period since the financial crisis back in 2008. So it's been an interesting time, and part of what I want to talk about today is what we're seeing, why our forecast came the way it was, which I didn't bring copies because they're all sold out. All of our copies are gone, although I think they still have some upstairs at the appraiser's office if you want a copy of it, or you can download it from our website at the Center for Real Estate. It's wichita.edu/real estate, and all of our housing forecast materials are available there. I guess I put together some materials, and a lot of the talks that I've done here this year related to the housing forecast have been have spent a lot more time talking about the overall economy. For those of you who don't know, that is my background. I have my PhD in economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I spent 5 years at the Federal Reserve in Cleveland as a financial economist prior to coming to Wichita State to run the real estate program here. And I guess the question that I have for all of you is, how much time would you like me to spend on this versus just going straight into the housing material? Because it's, you know, that's really your choice, and it's your time that I'm here to talk about. So I will just go ahead and start. And where's my mouse there? I wanted to. Oh, well. I will go ahead and start, and I'll talk about this. And then if you say, no, we'll move on to the housing, then I'll just move on. Okay. One of the questions that everybody's talking about is, are we in a recession? And one of the things that's hard to see here, are you able to move minimize the screen of the My mouse wasn't going, there it is. I couldn't get my mouse over there to minimize that. There we go. Now you can see the end of that, which is always going to be the most important, interesting part. One of the ways that we talk about a recession and sort of that rule of thumb you may have learned in your economics class is 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. And you can see that in the first and second quarters of last year, we did technically have negative GDP growth, which means that as a total economy, we were producing fewer goods and services than we were the previous quarter. But unfortunately, that rule of thumb that we often speak of in terms of what defines a recession, that's not actually the way a recession is defined. It turns out the way a recession is defined is a little bit the way the courts define pornography. We know it when we see it. And it's actually defined by a group with the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a private group of economists and academic economists primarily. And they have a group called the Recession Dating Committee that gets together several times a year. And their goal is to define the dates that recessions begin and end. And they are not concerned at all with being timely in that. Their goal is to be definitive. And so if we entered a recession earlier this year, they probably won't tell us until sometime the middle or end of next year that we actually started a recession. That being said, I think that the answer to that is going to be no, we are not currently in a recession. We might enter a recession next year, and there are a lot of people who think that that's a likelihood, but right now we're not in a recession. And why do I say that? Primarily because one of the big indicators that get onto my right thing here, one of the big indicators that the Recession Dating Committee looks at are labor markets. And so this is changes in total number of payroll jobs. And instead of looking at just the level of jobs, I wanted to look at how things changed since prior to the onset of the pandemic. And so the beginning point here is January of 2020. And you'll notice on here this blue shaded region, that is unofficial dates of recession by the Recession Dating Committee. And so that was the pandemic recession that lasted, I think, from April through June. It was a very, very short recession. Following that, we began this upward trend. You can see on here that total jobs lost in the US and in Wichita were about 14.5%. Okay, so minus 14.5 means that we lost 14.5% of our jobs from the beginning of January through July of 2020. Since then, we began recovering. And by the middle of last year, the United States as a whole was back up over zero, meaning that we had recovered all of the jobs that we had lost in the wake of the pandemic. Wichita, on the other hand, has not recovered all the jobs. We're still down about 2.5% compared to where we were prior to the pandemic. That's actually not uncommon for Wichita employment patterns and recessions. We often go up and then we fall. We don't come back to the previous peak. That's just been our tendency. This is the employment forecast that Jeremy Hill at the Center for Economic Development and Business Research put together for Wichita. The 2022 final figures are not yet available, but quite frankly, they'll be very close to this forecast because those numbers were pretty much baked into the system by the time they went to put together their forecast back in October. When Jeremy did his forecast this year for employment in Wichita, he had two forecasts. This is his optimistic forecast, but his pessimistic forecast really is not that pessimistic. His pessimistic forecast was that 2023, if things are worse, our employment situation will be basically flat instead of increasing by 1.1%. And if that happens, his forecast for employment growth in 2024 was stronger, so that it would basically go back up to the level he was projecting. So the question was, and he leans much more towards we're going into recession, and right now he leans more towards his negative forecast than his positive forecast. But that negative forecast still isn't very negative. And one of the reasons is that the aviation manufacturing sector actually still remains very, very strong. Now, I would give a caveat to this, which is that the Wichita economy tends to lag the national economy by about 6 to 12 months. So far, we have not seen, matter of fact, there was just a jobs report that came out this morning that, that employers are still hiring at a very strong pace, that these numbers are still very strong. The labor market isn't showing signs of weakness yet in terms of overall economy. Don't let the news reports that you've seen about big layoffs in big tech distort your view of the overall economy. That's a very narrow sector. And while it makes big headlines, it's not moving the needle on the overall numbers the same way. Yeah.
Is there an industry in Wichita that is taking the biggest hit? I mean, is aviation, you said we're still under where we were at before. Is that industry specific, or?
I don't have that number off the top of my head. So that'd be a question I'd refer you to Jeremy Hill on. Again, I know that he said that the aviation manufacturing sector right now looks very solid for employment growth going forward. And that is because, a lot of those headwinds that they'd been facing, with the Boeing Max and with some of the others, general aviation looks pretty strong. The defense work looks pretty strong. All of that can change like this, but right now that all looks pretty strong and favorable going forward, which is why even his pessimistic forecast was not very negative. Let me just add one thing, and then I'll get your question here, which is that I did say that the Wichita economy lags by about 6 to 12 months with the US economy. If we do go into a significant recession, that does tend nationally, that does tend to impact commercial aviation and general aviation, which is why we have this lag. So business travel tends to drop off when corporate profits drop, when we have a widespread general recession. And obviously business jet purchases drop off and so forth. And so if that happens, we'd really be looking into 2024, where we'd be seeing those employment declines. Now, Mr. Jewell, you had a question?
Sure. So we referred earlier to unemployment, and we've heard that nationally that there are more jobs available than there are unemployed, employable people. And that seems to continue. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So my next slide here is about the unemployment rate. So the jobs numbers look at businesses and how many people are on the payrolls. The unemployment rate looks at households and surveys individuals and says, do you have a job or do you not have a job? And right now, the unemployment rate, even though it's ticked up just slightly here over the last few months, it is still very near the historically low levels. And this is true not just in Wichita, but nationwide. And so, especially for Wichita, there's this dichotomy. How have we not recovered our employment? And yet our unemployment rates are at historic lows, right? That doesn't seem to make sense. And in conversations that we've had, I kind of have 3 reasons that I think we may have seen with that. Number one is that I do think the pandemic led to some early retirements for people. We've all been talking about the baby boomers and how they are going to be moving out of the labor force, and therefore they won't show up in either of these numbers. And that has been a long-term issue that a lot of industries have been trying to address. How do we find replacements for the people who are going to retire? Well, a lot of people, if you were close, you may have just said, I don't want to deal with this anymore. Forget it. I'm done. And nodded her head saying she was a little bit that way. And so we could have seen an acceleration of those retirements, and that should sort of recover itself over the next few years. But for now, leaves us in a very tight unemployment situation relative to the jobs numbers. That doesn't really explain Wichita, however, because that would have been a nationwide phenomenon. One story that people have, of course, is the availability of remote work. I'm a little less, I'm a little less enthusiastic about that story. Generally, what we've seen about remote work is that people who have decided to relocate in the face of the pandemic, the movements tended to be within the same metropolitan area. So I'm working at a job in New York City. I decide I want to move out of the city and I move to the suburbs so that I can do hybrid or remote work, but I'm still in the same general metropolitan area. And those are the patterns that we've seen almost everywhere across the country in terms of migration patterns. It's not people moving from Chicago or New York to Salina, Kansas, in order to be able to take advantage of low housing costs and lots of space and so forth. People still want the amenities of big cities. But the third story I do think has a little more traction, especially among the lower end service sectors in the economy. And that is that prior to the pandemic, remember all the pressure that we had about increasing minimum wage and all these areas where these workers were really, really struggling to make ends meet. And they would, in many cases, you'd have people who maybe they wanted to work full time, working as housekeeping staff at a hotel or someplace, but the hotel would not hire them full time because they'd have to bring on benefits. And so they'd limit their hours. And so they might be working 2 or 3 jobs to try and make up both the number of hours that they needed and the low wages that they had and the fact that they didn't have benefits. Well, in the wake of the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, the limitations meant that employers are increasing wages, and the increases in wages are at the very lowest levels, the biggest increases. And so you're seeing more employers in those areas who are saying, we'll do full-time, we'll do benefits, we'll increase the wages. All of a sudden, somebody who might have had 2 or 3 jobs before now only has 1, which means they show up the same in the unemployment report, I'm working, but now they went from being 3 people in the jobs report to only 1 person in the jobs report. And so I think that is one of the factors that has led to this dichotomy that we see. Does that make sense? So, nevertheless, the labor market still remains very, very strong, and that suggests that we are not in a recession right now. The biggest thing that people look at when they say, but we're going to go into a recession, is this picture, and it's called the yield curve. The yield curve looks at short-term interest rates, and this is Treasury interest rates, so what the federal government pays to borrow, and compares it with long-term interest rates. So if you look here, for instance, the 1-year point here, we see that the 1-year Treasury rate, and this was last week, was about 4.8%. The 10-year Treasury rate was about 3.95%. Okay, so in other words, borrowing for 1 year is a much higher interest rate that the federal government is paying than if they borrow money and lock it in for 10 years. Traditionally, many people have said that's a sign that we're about to enter into a recession when the yield curve inverts like this. In point of fact, what I think it really means is that markets believe that short-term interest rates will fall in the future. That's what this literally says. Now, often that happens because we go into a recession and then the Fed lowers interest rates, and it's usually the short-term side of things that they're moving. The Fed lowers interest rates in order to try and address the economic downturn, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so I think that there's another story that's at play here, and that has to do with this recent uptick that we've had in inflation. And so here I want some of the things I'm going to do from this point forward are going to be very long-term historical perspectives. So this is the headline inflation number. That's the blue line that you see on here, going all the way back to 1950. And again, the blue shaded regions on here are the official dates of recessions. And some of us, John was talking earlier about, remembering when inflation took off in the late 70s. And one one of the things I wanted to highlight in this picture, the red line is what we call sometimes core inflation. It's the consumer price index where we pull out food prices and energy prices because they tend to be more volatile. One of the things that you'll notice there is if you go back into the 1970s, the core inflation tends to lag. It tends to follow changes in that blue headline inflation number. When overall inflation goes up, core inflation tended to follow it. Okay, that really was a signal about how those volatile food and energy prices were really getting embedded into the prices of all other goods and services. Okay, when inflation rates finally began to fall in the 1980s, then again, the core inflation followed it. But now I want you to look at what happened starting in the late 90s, early 2000s. We started seeing the headline inflation number bounce around, but core inflation didn't move very much, right? And especially look at back in 2008 and 2009, which is, if you'll remember back then, in 2008, we had that huge run up in oil prices and gasoline prices went up to $4 a gallon. And everybody was going to sell their suburban houses and move into the inner city. And they were going to sell all their SUVs and they were going to buy tiny little cars. We really didn't have electric cars yet. But the next year, oil prices collapsed. Gasoline prices dropped back down to $2 a gallon. And you see headline inflation. We had negative inflation that year in 2009 for the first time since the 1950s. But notice in all of that the core inflation number really didn't move that much. It still bounced around that 2%. It dropped down as low as 1% by the time we hit 2012, but it stayed pretty level there. Well, go then in 2021, and there you see that pattern of core inflation following up headline inflation. And that's what had the Fed concerned. So you remember the discussion about transitory inflation, okay? And I'm on the record of saying when inflation started to show up in the early 2001, I was on the record of saying, we think this is transitory. And what we really meant by that wasn't that we thought that it was going to go away in a month or two. Instead, what we meant is that it's not demand-driven inflation. It's being caused by some one-time events that will resolve themselves on their own. And the first big event that led to the uptick inflation was the supply chain issues that we saw as we tried to restart from the pandemic. And quite frankly, that type of inflation, that supply side inflation, there's nothing the Fed can do to fix it. You can only wait for it to resolve. And mostly those supply chain issues have begun to resolve themselves. Although I say mostly in part because who knows what happens with China and all the things we have to have with China and their movements on the zero COVID policy. But then the second thing that happened that made that transitory worse was the war in the Ukraine. And that had a big impact on oil prices, energy prices, and on food prices, grains, commodities. And so that was a second hit that input things. And the third piece where the Federal Reserve and many economists, including myself, should have better anticipated this is that we then ended up with a demand side increase in inflation. So the supply chain issues, the oil, the war in the Ukraine, all of those are what we call supply side shocks. They reduced the supply of goods and services, which caused price levels to go up. But again, nothing the Fed could really do to resolve that issue, okay? But at the same time, all of the impacts of the enormous stimulus that the federal government, both the fiscal side and the monetary policy side, had put into the economy to deal with the downturn during the pandemic were finally really beginning to make themselves felt in the economy. And so we saw significant demand side. People wanted to spend all this additional wealth that they had, money that they had in related to not spending during the pandemic, the stimulus packages that we got, the federal government spending on all sorts of other programs, including grants that came down to local and state governments. You name it, all of that money was coming out trying to find a place to spend. And that then created a demand side increase. It's that issue that caused the Federal Reserve to pivot very rapidly and be very, very aggressive. And what they're really trying to do is try and break that. It's really all about expectations. When we begin to believe that inflation will be persistent, we begin to act in ways that make inflation persistent. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so the Fed is being very aggressive right now. And I think personally, they're probably doing more saber rattling than anything else. They're wanting to say, believe us, we are going to stamp this down and absolutely drive it out of the system. And we'll drive up interest rates to 30% if we have to make that happen. I mean, they've been incredibly aggressive. I believe that I will be surprised if they continue increasing interest rates further at this point, until at least they wait and see how much the recent declines in the inflation rate are really beginning to stabilize themselves. And I think financial markets generally agree with me on this, although the stock market did take a big hit today when that big jobs number came out, because again, they're very worried about, maybe that'll change the Fed's response. But what really matters for market interest rates is not headline inflation. It's not what inflation was over the past year. It's what we think inflation will be over the coming year. So inflation expectations. And again, on here, the blue line is the headline inflation number, okay? The red line is, and that's backward looking. The blue line is backward looking. It's what was inflation over the past 12 months. The red line is a survey of the University of Michigan calling up households and just asking, what do you think inflation will be over the next year? And for about the past year, that's been hovering around 5.5%. Okay, that's what consumers expect. The green line, however, is a measure that comes from financial markets. And it looks at the interest rate on traditional treasury securities, and it compares it with an interest rate on something called a TIPS security, Treasury Inflation Protected Security, TIPS. And those TIPS securities, with a traditional treasury, the way it works is you buy a treasury note and you give the federal government, $1,000, okay? And then the federal government takes that, and every 6 months they pay you a coupon interest rate. That's the interest rate on that. And then every 6 months they do that. And at the end of its term, let's say it's 5-year term, they then pay you back the last period of interest and the $1,000. Because all those are nominal payments, they're not adjusted for inflation. The interest rate that you charge them on that you get from that has to compensate you for inflation that you think will occur over the next 5 years. Contrast that with the TIPS security. You get the same 6-month interest rate, but at the end of the first year, the Treasury Department goes through and they say, what was inflation the last year? Oh, prices increased by 8%. We're therefore going to increase the face value of this bond from $1,000 to $1,080, an 8% increase, to compensate you on the back end for actual inflation that occurred. The interest that you get next year is based off of that new higher principal amount. The same thing happens at the second year, the third year, the fourth year, and the fifth year. Since you're protected on the back end for actual inflation that occurs, the interest rate that you have to get on that bond, that note, is lower than what you would need on a traditional treasury. That difference is an implicit measure of what financial markets are betting average inflation will be over that time period. That's what that green line is. And you can see that right now, the 5-year break-even rate is what we call it, or the average inflation financial markets are betting literally hundreds of billions of dollars on. They are projecting that over the next 5 years, average inflation is only going to be about 2.3%. Okay. That is what I look at to say that inflation is going to come under control and relatively quickly. Again, financial markets could be wrong, but that's where I would put my money if I was betting. Questions on that? Yeah. Daily. We can observe the prices of trading of these securities every single day. I think the numbers that I have on here are weekly numbers, weekly averages, but they are out there, every day. So Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has a fantastic tool if you want any sort of economic data. It's called the FRED, F-R-E-D, Federal Reserve Economic Data. And you can you put in the break-even rate, it'll pop up and you can get that graph and it has the latest data on it. All right. Mortgage bankers. So now going to talk about housing markets and where we are with housing markets. Mortgage Bankers Association is pretty much on the same page with this. My watch fell behind, so I'm going to keep an eye on that one there. And their forecast is that the 30-year fixed mortgage rate by the end of 2024 is going to fall down to, I think, if I recall right, that's 4.3% is what their forecast is through the end of next year. Not yet, now it's the end of next year. And so that can only happen if inflation does in fact come back down into that target range. And again, 2% is the Fed's target range for long-term inflation. That's where they want to see it average over time. And so I think that may be a little bit lower than what I personally would expect. But again, I use their numbers whenever I do my forecast. I think somewhere between 5.5 and 6 is a very realistic range for some time over stabilizing out over time. So with all of that, one thing to keep in mind, and I think this may be why why the Mortgage Bankers Association is forecasting even lower, is that how did we get to these incredibly low mortgage rates that we had previously? Since the financial crisis, interest rates were down below 4% for much of the period since the financial crisis back in 2008, and they dropped down below 3% during the pandemic and in the wake of the pandemic. How did that happen? A lot of that was driven not by true market fundamentals. Oops, went the wrong way. Go back. But rather, it was driven by the Federal Reserve's actions in the long end of the term structure. So we've all heard this term quantitative easing, right? That's just a fancy word for saying traditionally when the Fed interacts and when they engage in the market, they will buy short-term treasury securities, 3-month, 6-month, 1-year treasury securities. They buy these very short-term treasury securities and try to do that to influence short-term interest rates. In the wake of the financial crisis, they began a very aggressive purchasing of longer-term treasury securities, 5-year, 10-year, 30-year treasury securities. And in addition, they wanted to intervene directly into mortgage markets by buying mortgage-backed securities. And prior to the financial crisis, they had never owned mortgage-backed securities. And then starting in 2009, they ramped up and purchased over $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities. And then you remember the taper tantrums when they started to come off of that and they lowered down, they stabilized at about 1.8 million, about 0.8 trillion, $800 billion. And then in 2013, they upped it up to about $1.75 trillion. And they were finally coming off of that. And we were finally, what I was hoping was getting to a world of more normalcy in mortgage markets. Again, this directly caused fixed mortgage rates to be lower than they would have otherwise. Okay, this action's by the Fed. Then in the financial crisis, they tripled down and ended up going up to about almost 2.7 trillion. They have begun to back off on that and recently. So you can see the blue line is starting to taper down. They've said they're going to do the same thing with long-term treasury securities. But the way that they do it is that they are letting them run off the books. So they are not selling these securities on the open market. Instead, as borrowers pay off their mortgages, they are going to not replace them at the same rate with new mortgage-backed security holdings. Now, this is going to take a long time because since interest rates are a lot higher, borrowers are prepaying their mortgages much slower. So this is a process that will take a long time. And I think that's one reason why the Mortgage Bankers Association is forecasting rates to go down to the low 4s, as opposed to where I think it would be more reasonable in somewhere in the 5s, is because of that. Does that make sense? So that's the piece to keep in mind as it affects housing markets going forward. So what have we seen here in housing markets? Well, I'll show our original forecast numbers. Our original forecast numbers ended up being wrong for this year. Okay. We went to press at, I said early September is when we had to do that. And at that time, mortgage rates had begun to come up, but then they had started to come back down and it actually dropped below 6% when we went. And so we thought we had seen the peak of that. And then we saw a new round that raised them up above, I think they peaked out at almost 7.5%. When they finally peaked out. The home sales activity just has absolutely cratered over the last few months. These are unofficial numbers still, but through the year in 2022 ended up being down for the full year about 13% compared to 2021. And that's we were ahead of pace going in from the summer, okay? And our forecast was for a decline, but the drop-off was much sharper than what we anticipated. And again, the increase in the interest rates was sharp as well. But I think that there's this drop-off, it's been a really sharp drop-off the last 3 months in home sales activity. I think is getting more attention than it really deserves in terms of what's really happening in housing markets. And so I want to show you a few other things. And again, with some long-term perspective of where these are. I did want just to show, because I thought you'd be interested in terms of new home sales. We actually, it looks like, these aren't final numbers, but it looks like we're going to end up 2022 with just exactly the same number of new home sales. New home sales are weird, so I'll caveat that in a minute, but same number of new home sales last year that we did in 2021. Okay. Now, again, the first part of 2021 was really, really strong with permitting. One thing to understand, these numbers come from the multiple listing service. New home sales are really, really hard to fully accurately gauge from the multiple listing service, because what will happen is a home builder will put a home on the multiple listing service to bring in the marketing. A buyer will come in. The buyer may end up doing a custom home or may have another home that was started as a spec home. They will buy that home. It will never have been listed in the multiple listing service. And even though they're sort of supposed to put it in there as a comp later, they very frequently don't with new homes. Did I capture that accurately, John, in terms of the challenges of new homes in the multiple listing service? And so we'll talk a little bit later about permitting activity, which I think is a really good proxy for new home sales, because for the most part, you don't pull a permit unless you're confident you're going to sell that home. Okay. But the drop off significantly here was in existing homes this year, not in new homes. So yes.
The drop off. Is it because the product out there isn't what people want?
So one of the issues that we've had, and this is predates the pandemic, is that we had a real shortage of inventory of homes available for sale. And you go back and you look at the housing forecasts that we put out in 2017 and 2018 and 2019. And a continuing refrain that we kept talking about is home sales are going to be constrained, not because of demand, but because of the lack of inventory. So this is the number of homes that are listed on the MLS. And you can see back prior to the financial crisis, you go back into the early 2000s, and we were averaging up above 4,000 homes available for sale on the MLS. Went up a little bit following the downturn, and then we started whittling away these numbers. And we had really gotten back to what would be considered a balanced market, and I'll show that later, by the time we hit about 2012. Okay, where we really had a balanced market between supply and demand, but we just weren't putting enough homes on the market. Some of this is construction activity, which we'll talk about later, but some of it is just sellers not, putting their homes on the available for sale. One of the challenges sometimes that realtors would talk about is potential sellers who wouldn't put their home on the market because they were fearful of becoming homeless. I sell my house too quickly, and then I won't be able to find something to buy. And this was an issue that we were dealing with in 2016, 17, 18, 19. We were telling stories of bidding wars and other things going on. You'll notice that the inventories just collapsed in 2020 and 2021. What happened in 2020, we thought that demand was going to soften in the wake of the pandemic. People would be concerned about jobs and so forth. It turned out that demand was absolutely just blew up in the face of the pandemic. And it wasn't the pandemic that caused it per se, but mostly the policy responses to the pandemic. Number one, people who are most likely to be home buyers were the least likely to be laid off during the pandemic. People who were most likely to be home buyers were more able to pivot, work from home, do those things. It was the workers that physically had, physical presence was absolutely essential. They were the most likely to get laid off in the pandemic. Number two, everyone got the stimulus checks, irrespective of whether they got laid off. Number three, people are now sitting around looking at their four walls. Now, I don't really so much think of that as being an issue of I have to have a home office. It's more an issue of cabin fever. I'm looking at this, I'm getting sick of it, I'm getting bored with it. Number four, because people couldn't spend their money, they got these stimulus checks, households got their financial lives in order in a way that we'd not seen in decades. People paid down debt, they couldn't go spend money eating out, they couldn't spend money traveling. Some of the big ticket purchases they couldn't get because of the supply chain issues. So their financial lives were in order. And then number five, mortgage rates dropped to levels that we had never seen before. And I think in many instances, what we ended up with is people said, I'm never going to have this opportunity again. I want to go buy. And even if I overpay a little bit, I'm going to go buy. The problem was we didn't have inventory before that happened. And so what used to be a bidding war where you might say, oh, we've got a really great house, and this would happen in 2017, 18, and 19. Got a nice house, we'd put it on the market, go on the market on a Wednesday, it'd be on the market for a week. The following week, we'd have 3-5 offers, we'd pick the best offer. It would be close to the asking price. By the time you got to spring 2021, everything had been picked over. If there was a good house, it would go on the market and you would literally have, well, I'll give an example of my son. Tried to buy a house in College Hill. Nice house, good house, priced at the top of the market, asking price. He came in, it was put on that market at Thursday. By the time Thursday rolled around, Wednesday night, Thursday had, I think, 12 showings, another 12 showings on Friday. The realtor said final and best offer by Friday at 8 p.m. My son put in a bid that was 15% above asking price, waived inspections, and could provide a guarantee that he could cover if there was an appraisal deficit. And he still did not get the house. Okay. And this was becoming more commonplace. Absolutely insane. As I have talked to realtors over the last several months, one of the things I've had to do is, their initial thing is, oh, the market has just dropped off. It's nothing. He said, so if you get a listing that's a not good listing, in good shape, and priced right, what happens? Oh, we're still getting multiple offers on those. It's just that we're not getting them waiving inspections, and we're not getting them with, and it's still above asking price. Okay. It's the ridiculous things that were happening in late 2020 and through 2021, those have stopped. But but we're still seeing an incredibly tight market. Okay, that's the point that I want you to take away from. Part of our perspective, and part of the reason I think people are so, oh, the sky is falling in. I think there are two reasons people are being a little Chicken Little-ish about the housing market. One is somehow thinking this is the same as it was back in 2008. It's not. Okay. And number two is that they're comparing it with what was such an insane market for the past 2 years. A couple of other measures to kind of give you that picture with this. Month supply. I said that we went back into a balanced market back in 2013. We measure balance in the housing market by looking at a number we call month supply. We take the number of homes that are actively available for sale, and we divide it by the average pace of sales over the past 12 months. So for instance, if you've got 1,000 homes on the market and you're on average selling 200 homes a month, then 1,000 divided by 200, it would take you 5 months to work through that inventory. We traditionally think of a balanced market as being one with between a 4 and a 6 month supply. That's just, there's nothing magical about it. It's just a rule of thumb, but that's traditionally what we think. More than a 6 month supply becomes a buyer's market where buyers have the leverage. Below a 4 month supply, it becomes a seller's market. And you can see that we went into a buyer's market in 2010, 2011 in Wichita, and then we came down quickly, and we really became a true seller's market by the end of 2014. And again, we saw that in terms of what was happening with appreciation rates, with the time on market and so forth. Prior to entering the pandemic, we were down to a 2 months supply. At the lowest level in Wichita, it dropped down to a 0.6 months supply early last year. And even right now, I think the number is a 1.2 months supply in December. So it's come up a lot. It's almost doubled since early last year, but it is still what we would consider an insanely tight market, and significantly tighter still than it was back prior to the onset of the pandemic. Okay. Another way we could look at that is asking, how are buyers and sellers negotiating price? And so this is, the blue line is the fraction of homes that have sold for a price less than the original asking price. So Ann puts her house on the market. She says, I'm going to sell this for $200,000. I come in, I make an offer. Often what would happen is I might offer her, oh, I'm going to offer you $195. We negotiate, we sell it for $198. It's sold 1% below the original asking price. Okay. Traditionally, we had about 60% of homes would sell at that discount from the original asking price, meaning 40% sold at a price at or above the original asking price. Okay. As the market was becoming very much a buyer's market, that actually went up to about 80% of all homes sold at a discount compared to the original asking price. Okay. We had gotten back down to a place in the beginning of 2020 where it was back down to that more normal level of about 60%. we got down to a place where it was fewer than 40% of homes sold at a discount, which means that more than 60% of all homes sold at a price at or above the original asking price. That's come up recently, but it is still far below that normal level. Now, again, you know, we don't know where if that trend is that we're seeing right now is going to continue and level out, or if it's going to go up significantly higher. But right now, we're not at a place where the transactions that we're observing in the market are showing a strong buyer's market. It still seems to be leaning towards a seller's market. I forgot to mention one thing with the change in the market structure. We are also hearing more situations where, you know, for a long time, when we said inventories were really tight, most of the inventory that was out there was the crap that nobody wanted to buy. I think somebody asked me that question, right? When things got really bad, people were buying the crap too. Okay. People aren't buying the crap now. Okay. So, you know, it is much less likely for a seller to be able to put a house on the market that is not market ready, you know, needs to replace the carpet, needs to do painted, needs some other updates and things, and be able to get a good price for it, a premium price. People will always buy those, but they want to buy them at a discount so they can fix them up, turn them into rentals, or flip them and sell them to another seller. That's become more normal in that range. Okay, so I want to say, but good houses, the houses that are in neighborhoods that people desire, in the right price ranges that people can afford, that are move-in ready, that are prepared for the market properly, those are still selling in a matter of days, if not hours, with prices that are at or above asking price. One of the things that I did not show here in my graphs, but it's the number of new listings. Okay, so new homes that are put on the market for the first time in a given month. And in December, that was down 21% compared to the prior December. So even though the market is softening in that sense that demand is dropping off a little bit, supply is still dropping off too, which I think if to the extent that sellers are fearful, this is a bad time to put on the market. Again, if their home is priced right, if it is in good condition, in a good location, they're wrong. It's a great time to put on the market because there's nothing out there. Yeah.
Crap homes. Used to be that there were there were just a few people that were buying those.
Mhm.
Now I get letters and phone calls. I want to buy your rental property. Is the increase in the number of companies that are doing that, is that affecting the market value of those, or how does that?
That's a great question. And I don't have any data to be able to really, assess that or answer that question in a reliable way. It's certainly, we hear all these things, right? I mean, I don't know. They don't seem to pay any attention to the do not call lists or anything like that. But then again, neither do the politicians. So why should I be surprised? The thing is, those buyers have to buy at a discount, right? And those that don't buy at a discount are going to be out of business pretty quickly, right? Because you have to be able, there's a lot of work and a lot of risk in doing all of that, because you don't know when you buy that thing what you're going to run into. So in that sense, my gut reaction is to say that it's not, but I don't have data to answer that definitively.
Competition is if they want to play the game, you got to have inventory, so they got to buy something, or they're just. So I didn't know if the fact that there's now 15 or 20 companies that are vying for those versus before where there's one or two.
It's also possible that what we see is that we're now more aware of all the people out there who are doing it, but it's not necessarily more people, right? It's just that they're reaching out to you differently. So I'm not convinced, but I could be convinced that there's an impact of that. I just don't have data to move there. Last one I wanted to look at just in terms of the tightness of the market was the days on market numbers. And so how long does it take between when you put a home on the market and when you actually sell it? And again, go back to the early 2000s as typical. 40 days on market was the median. Half the homes were on the market for more than 40 days. Half the homes were on the market less than 40 days. Prior to the pandemic, we were down to 20 median days on market. Even though it's come up here in recent months, we're sitting at, less than 10 days on market. I think average for last year, median number was 4 days on market was the median days on market for all of last year. And it was 10 days in December. So again, homes are selling quickly. And sometimes the homes that are on the market for a long time, it's because they're the crap homes that nobody wants to buy. So as a result, we've seen extremely strong home price appreciation. We don't have the fourth quarter numbers yet. We won't have it for a couple months. The 17% that we had second quarter, 15% or so that we saw third quarter, that decline second, third, and third quarter in the appreciation rate means slowing appreciation. It doesn't mean falling prices. Quarter to quarter changes were still positive between the second and third quarter. And I think we'll continue to see that. Our forecast is for home prices to continue to increase, but not nearly at that pace that we've had. A 4 to 5% increase in Wichita is incredibly strong appreciation for Wichita normally. And that's where our forecast kind of moves into. And again, it's even as demand softens, people still need to buy for a lot of reasons. And so there's really nothing that's going to limit that. And in addition, there aren't other alternatives to buying existing homes. New home construction costs continue to rise at a relatively healthy clip. Rents continue to rise, and I'll show a couple things with that. So I'm at 10:56. So I've got some things on new home construction. Am I okay to go a couple minutes over, or do you need me to hard stop? Yep.
Is there any research yet on the impact of short-term rentals on the availability of homes to buy?
There's not been anything in the Wichita area that I've seen. I'm trying to think to the extent that I've seen that. I'd have to go and look and see if anybody's been working on that question in larger markets. I will say that Wichita has not been subject to the sort of institutional buying of single family homes the way that that you've heard about in some of the larger markets. It's much more common to see that sort of institutional buying in the construction side of things. So you'll have a market down in Dallas where a Wall Street investor will go and they'll hire a builder, developer to go and build 1,000 home subdivision. And they will go and just buy all that up front and intending it for rentals with the possibility of selling it later. Okay. And that can be done. That doesn't happen in Wichita, in part because we don't grow that fast. We're a tertiary market, so they're slow to look to us anyway. And getting the land to do it is a really big challenge because the local developers have got control over developable land for the near future. Okay. But I will say we're seeing a little bit things that are similar to that when it comes to duplexes, right? And duplex construction. So that's really where I wanted to go and talk. So these are single family building permits, again, monthly numbers. The moving average is there to kind of reflect the trend. And these are the numbers that are collected by the Builders Association. It's a rough proxy for the metropolitan area, but over time, be aware they have added small communities as they felt like their membership treated that as a part of the greater Wichita area. Okay. But you can see, that following the financial crisis, we dropped off and we finally stabilized around 2014 or so of building about 1,000 homes per year. Okay. But that was in contrast to 2,000 to 2,500 per year prior to the onset of the financial crisis. That 1,000 homes per year was simply not enough to meet the demand and the need that we had for new housing. My best guess, just kind of on some long-term things I did a long time ago for the city of Bel Air, was that we needed to kind of average out about 1,500 new homes per year to sort of accommodate the level of population growth that we'd had and the expected demolition or retirement of older homes that are on the market. I think that's the piece that's often the hardest to get your brain around, right? Is Jack DeBoer famously once said, "We're not overbuilt, we're under demolished." And that's the question. Yeah, Jack.
Stan, I think in this permitting that you've got in your presentation, how much effect is the marketing of the small towns around the city of Wichita affected? Because I know the cities are giving developers and even the existing market stuff that the city of Wichita, for some that we don't seem to necessarily feel it's necessary or not, I don't know, to the point we're almost completely circled by these little towns that's giving away this incentive. A lot of it has to do with school districts. I know that. But.
Right. Well, remember, these numbers include all of those permits put together. Okay, so these are not just city of Wichita. These are Wichita plus Bel Air plus Valley Center plus going out to Newton and El Dorado. I mean, it's all of these small communities. Wichita numbers do dwarf all those other smaller communities in these permits. So I wouldn't speculate on how much that's impacting that dynamic. I'm really thinking about the broader market as a whole as a trade-off. And so you have the trade-off of housing in different communities, schools, but you also have proximity. Where's your proximity to, downtown, proximity to work, employment, and so forth. So those are the things that households look at. Now, I mentioned that duplexes are something that really have taken off, especially since the permits. Now, these numbers come from the U.S. Bureau of the Census, and these are officially for the entire metropolitan area. And what they do is they do request permitting offices to report every month, and then they do estimates for those where they don't feel like either they're not a reporting office or others. So the numbers that you get from the census don't match exactly for single family numbers with what we get from the Builders Association for some of their estimation procedures that we have. But again, the trends here are what we're looking at, and you can see a really sharp, you can see that two-family properties actually saved a lot of home builders, kept them from going bankrupt in the wake of the financial crisis. And then in recent years, they've really taken off as we've had this need for, shortage of housing, and that's been one of the places to do. I will just mention with this, and I think we've had these discussions before, most of these, to my knowledge, that have been built intended as rentals, okay? And the developers that are doing them want them to be rentals and do that. Lawrence, for a long time, the starter home market in Lawrence has been what they call twin homes, where it is essentially just two homes side by side, duplex, to try and get the building costs down a little bit, because that's a more expensive market than Wichita traditionally. And in doing that, they'll do lot splits with them so that it's not, one lot with two living units on it, but rather it's two adjacent lots that share a wall. And that is something that I think ought to at least be considered in terms of, addressing issues as we've had prices of homes go up so much, and as we have had mortgage rates go up, that's impacting affordability. It's not going to make a huge difference, but every little piece makes a difference on the margin, and that could be a way. It's my understanding that there have been some political issues of concerns that duplexes are not as desirable as single family homes. I think, the question would be, is that duplexes or is that owner occupied versus renter occupied? My wife and I joke, I bought the duplex next door to my house, and I did it so that I could control a rental property that was next to me. Didn't really have a desire to be a landlord, but my wife and I, when we're working on things at the duplex, we tell the joke that, God on the seventh day, he didn't decide to rest. He just looked at all that he'd made and he said, it's good enough. After all, it's only a rental and the tenants are going to tear it up anyway. And so there is something to be said for an owner occupied house being taken care of in a way that a renter occupied house is not going to be done. And that comes from the occupant's perspective. I'm not there long term. And it comes from the owner's perspective. And so I think that's a question that's really worth looking at. So I thought I'd pull together and say, what have these two families and single family permits done together? And I took the census numbers for the two family permits and I added them to the Builders Association's numbers for the one family permits, for the single family permits. Not the best methodological choice to make, but I think it's easier for us to look at these trends and see these things. And what you can see is that that spread starting about 2016 starts to get wider, that the two family homes have really added and made a big difference in the total number of housing units that have been added to the market, especially as we get back in the last 2 years or so. Okay. So I found that to be an interesting picture. One other thing that I just wanted to mention, and these are not mine, but it relates to the apartment market. And this comes from NAI Martins and their annual, did I get there? There we go. Make sure I didn't jump two slides there. No, I didn't. Their annual market report on what's happening in apartment markets. And they have by far the best data of anybody in town in terms of what's going on with apartment markets. And so occupancy rates in the apartment side, one of the questions that I've asked for a long time with all of the new apartment building that we've seen over the last 10 years, apartment developers always do it. They overbuild, right? It's just a part of the apartment cycle. We have demand out there for 3,000 new units. And so therefore we have 10 apartment developers, each who build a 5-unit apartment complex. And now we've got 5,000 new units when we had demand for 3,000. And as a result, the market then goes into a period where rents are stagnant, occupancy rates are low, and we will take a time to absorb that. Happened in the 70s, happened in the 80s, happened in the 90s. It happens all the time in the apartment market. We still have not seen that here. Occupancy rates are incredibly strong in the apartment market. And these are again, for true apartment complexes. Everything I hear from small landlords is the same thing. No difficulty in leasing out places. Rent growth was a little bit lower in 2022, but still positive and really strong in 2021. And we have heard stories nationwide about rent growth beginning to decline. Don't pay much attention to nationwide numbers about anything related to housing. Housing markets are local, okay? And so while you can have trends that happen simultaneously across multiple markets, each market has its own distinct fundamentals, and you really should look at that. This was the number of units added to the market that they calculated in the apartment report that NAI Martins did. The one thing that they did mention in there is that their number of expected units to come online over the next couple of years was enormously high. And I personally would not want to be a developer who has projects that are supposed to be coming out in 2023, 2024. At some point, we have to reach a point where we have saturated this market. But again, we haven't done it. I keep asking. I thought maybe with all the new apartments, they're really the Class A plus. I thought maybe the older Class A apartments would be suffering. But I talked to apartment managers and they say, no, really solid rent growth, high occupancy rates. Maybe it's Class B apartments or Class C. Nope, all the way through the spectrum, they're doing well. And so it's like, where are all the people coming from? Yes, we haven't been building enough single family homes, but we've certainly been building enough apartments, and yet the demand isn't being satiated. So one last question that I asked is, what's happening to average household size? And so Ann asked me this question before we started, is where are all the people coming from? Wichita is a slow growth community. Our population grows at a very slow, steady rate. Certainly, we need new housing units to accommodate new population growth. We need new housing units to replace older housing units that are either no longer occupiable or don't meet the needs and desires of modern households. But the other thing that we have here is that the average number of people per household continues to get smaller. It was 2.62 back in 2000, and this is US data. In 2021, the average number of people per household was down to 2.51. We did see a blip during the 2010 financial crisis, maybe a small blip during the pandemic, where people would move back in with each other. These have been long-term trends, okay, of average household size getting smaller. I did a quick back of the envelope calculation for Wichita. I don't remember my numbers now. On my PowerPoint, I had a cheat sheet on this, and I don't remember it off the top of my head for Wichita, but I remember for the state of Kansas as a whole. Just this change with the population that we have in Kansas would require an additional 50,000 housing units, just based on this change in the number of people per household. In Wichita, I think it was somewhere around 10,000 housing units, but don't hold me to that because I don't remember that number off the top of my head. So, this is an issue that I think does have an impact on that. And again, this trend continues that we have fewer people living in each household. So with that, I think that's everything. I did put on here my, did I duplicate that slide on there? I did put on my forecast. Again, the forecast numbers clearly are going to be much lower. I put in a cheat sheet on my notes side on my other thing, but I don't have it here with me. With the single family building permits, we were pretty close with single family permits up through about October, and then come October, things really cratered with single family new home construction in Wichita. Those numbers are going to be significantly lower this year, and it's going to be lower in 2023. However, I do believe that given the shortages that we have in the housing market and the lack of single family homes compared to the demand that we have for it, new home construction is going to pick up again. But I think part of what we have to do is households have to acclimate. So you remember when it got really, really cold and, it dropped down into the single digits and below zero, and you were just bitterly cold. And then it went back up to 20 degrees. Was it last week when it got to 20 degrees? And it's like, oh, that's great. We're walking around in t-shirts, right? Once you acclimated to the cold weather, it didn't feel quite so bad anymore. And when interest rates move, that's one of the things that happens, is that there is this short-term, that price that I was going to pay, the monthly payment I was going to have for this house. Now is that maybe I have to go down just a little bit in the price point that I'm looking at. Maybe I just need to tighten my budget somewhere else. Okay, but man, we're having another kid. We need to buy. We've said we're going to, at some point, people make that move. And I would expect that as we get into the spring, that we're going to hear, maybe it's the optimist in me, but I think we're going to see home builders saying, yeah, we're getting a lot more action now. It was really, really ugly for a few months, but we're getting action, and it's ugly right now. Okay. So
Stan, can I ask one question? You went back a while ago, you were afraid about the apartments being overbuilt. How many outside organizations are coming in here building in relationship to, they may hire a local builder to do the actual construction, but the financial packages and it does all the research and stuff based on what you just got through saying, we're going to have a shortage anyhow. What, do you have any feeling for what percentage of them are outside people coming in?
I don't have a great feel, so I'm going to speculate on that. Of the new apartment construction we have, I'm going to speculate that it's less than half that is outside developers. But I'd want to talk to Jeff Englert over at Martin's, because he tracks all of those all the time, and that's just not a piece of data that I track. And again, somebody in the planning commission probably planning department probably has that too, because they'd know who was filing. But sorry, I can't answer it better. So, well, thank you all. I've enjoyed it, appreciated it. I hope it's been interesting and useful.
It's been
Stan,
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
If there's a
again
single
for a very
takeaway that I have,
informative-
it's that, supply is still really tight. And so even though demand is softening and substantially, I mean, really, really softening, it's not something that I think we're all of a sudden, the fundamentals to say, oh, we're going to have a housing market collapse the way we did back in 2009 and 10, that the fundamentals just aren't there to support that. And that's been I've been hearing my colleagues around the country saying as well. So,
Thank you, sir.
all right, thank you.
Okay. Now I'd like to have Mary maybe introduce our next speaker is Tia Ramont, Transportation Department.
And you said my name beautifully. Hello, I'm
Thank you.
up here. Hi, my name is Tia Ramat, and I've got Allison Fletcher with Nelson Nygaard online with me. She's been our consultant. This is the Downtown Streets Plan. We were here 7 months ago and presented to you. Today, we'll do a shorter presentation. It's graphically a little more descriptive. And we're going to ask you for a motion today. I learned in the recent months that this does need to go to the entire Planning Commission for consideration. So this will be at the end of the month's Planning Commission meeting also. And with that, let me find the keyboard and move forward. Okay, it's not. Let me see if the mouse works. Oh, there we are. Okay. We'll do a quick introduction of the project again for fresher memory, key concepts, next steps. There's a detailed staff report handout here in front of me. In short, we hope to get this to City Council in the first quarter of this year for consideration. A lot of work has gone into this plan beginning in 2018 up until now. This is one of those plans that was put on ice during COVID, and we had to refresh it and start over again, if you will, exercising the content of the plans with the steering committees and the various. We've done 12 presentations to date for this plan. So we are really getting the word out there. Oops, I am not able to control the slides real well. Okay, here are the draft goals of the plan. These are the results of public outreach and comments. This did not come from staff. This came from the general public. And some of this is reiterated from the original downtown plan that was adopted in 2010. So enhance safety and health of downtown, prioritize active transportation options, provide mobility choices, embrace technology, and foster consistent economic development, and manage our infrastructure and vibrancy of downtown are really the chief goals that we were hearing over and over again in public meetings that those that participated wished to see with downtown. They really want to see downtown revitalized. And this plan, this is a slide that just shows the amount of outreach that happened before 2020 and this plan went on ice. 20,000 postcards were mailed. We had 24 public facing events. Scott Wadle did an enormous amount of talking and meetings and presentations on this plan before it was put on ice. Since we've taken it off of ice in 2022, we've done about 12 presentations to groups like yours, and I won't belabor this. We're just trying to get this back to a place where it can be taken up for a vote. Again, I'm not going to sit on this, but this plan was exercised in workshops, design charrettes. We had pop-up events at Riverfest. We did a big virtual online engagement. So we've really tried. And this is our schedule, if you will, for reviving this plan. We had a new steering committee appointed. We came to advanced plans in July. I didn't know we needed to bring it to the full planning commission at that point because I was too new, but we do need a vote. So that's my big ask of you today. And with that, I think I'm going to invite Allison to take over, and I will flip the slides for her as we go through. Allison, are you able to speak online?
Does it sound good on your end?
Could you speak up just a smidge? Yes,
Yeah. Are you
Okay.
hearing me okay?
we can hear you.
For those, just refreshing your memory, this is a map of the study area from the project going from Murdoch down to Kellogg, from the river all the way east to just a few blocks beyond the railroad and the highway. And this lays out what the recommendations were, the conceptual vision plan for the streets in downtown, which ones would carry transit in the future, where bike facilities would be, where parking would be, in some cases where on-street parking is added, and where lanes might be changing direction, or there may be lanes reduced that are not needed today and being converted to other uses. From a high level, there's some traffic signals in the downtown that have been upgraded, actually, some of which since the completion of this plan. But other things that are comprised in the plan are some road diets earmarked for Broadway and Waterman, two-way conversions on Main, Market, Topeka, Emporia, and English, focusing transit facilities on Broadway and Douglas and doing enhancements on those, and making sure that there's a complete all ages and abilities network across the downtown, roughly every 2 to 3 blocks or so, to make sure people can get across the downtown by bike and scooter. On the next slide, this talks a bit about phasing, which has had quite a bit of update since the completion of our process there. So those streets that are in navy are those that have been planned in the near term in collaboration with the engineering department and their capital improvement plan, and what makes sense for when streets need repaving or some signals can get updated. So some of those two-way conversions that I mentioned would happen in the more near term with striping and signal updates. In the midterm, those streets with gold, so looking at Broadway and Waterman. And then in a longer term status, all of these streets could be evaluated from that preliminary implementation for consideration for long-term, maybe moving curbs, doing some bulb outs, refining the designs. And there's a couple streets that need further study that we want to kind of isolate beyond the scope of the conceptual plan itself. So on the next slide, I was just going to go into some of the details of what's happening on certain streets. First, as a proof of concept, Emporia Street became two-way. This was discussed, and some of the concept development happened during the engagement and stakeholder meetings that we had as part of our planning process. That upgrade for that corridor cost around $400,000 and involved traffic signals and markings. There was a lot of work with the adjacent owners and businesses to make sure curbside programming was meeting their needs and their considerations were taken into account. And there's been some pretty great outcomes from a result of that implementation since it happened. On the next slide, going through some of the other streets. So Market Street today, in the picture on the top, that is, a two-lane, one-way street with bike lane only in one direction. You tend to have on-street parking on many blocks. Just in a typical section on the image on the bottom, some streets would, some sections or blocks of that street would be able to sustain parking on both sides of the street with the widths, but we would propose changing those 2 lanes going in one direction to having 1 lane in each direction and having that be a pair with Topeka, and making sure that there's biking facilities in both directions to lead to more intuitive, safe outcomes for people biking on that street for a more complete street. On the next slide, we have Topeka. So very similar condition. On some select blocks, there's angled parking today. On some blocks, there's parallel parking. But on very many streets or blocks of this street, you could have the floating parking lane protecting the bike lane against the curb, which is a more appropriate biking facility for people of all abilities and people who are young and old to be biking within a downtown environment. So both of these would be two-way conversions. On the next slide, this is English Street, so running east-west. One of the things that we looked at as an opportunity with this street, when you convert the number of driving lanes and some of the turn lanes, we'd have an opportunity to add more parking and angled parking along that street, so increasing the supply close to the heart of the downtown. On the next slide, this is Main Street, which is currently a 4-lane one-way street, which leads to lots of speeding, and we want to have some safer outcomes. So looking at having two-way access to complete the more intuitive network of having two-way circulation. There's still room. There's some very overly wide lanes right now, that you could narrow each of the lanes and be able to have two-way circulation with a center turn lane to allow like similar capacity and function in the street, but with some safer outcomes. So going to streets in the more midterm, this is a representation of Waterman Street. So in the existing condition, you have two lanes in each direction. That's the image on the top. And in the proposed configuration, doing a traditional road diet, a street that's 3 lanes can very often carry the same amount of capacity and circulation with safer outcomes in a 3-lane configuration, especially because you have the left turn lanes opposing each other. And so people have better sight lines on the street. And that frees up about a lane of room to be able to also have bike lanes going in both directions. This is really important on the south side of downtown, being able to have an east-west facility that can also get people safely over the river just west of downtown. On the next slide, this is Broadway. There was a lot of attention paid to the potential for this street, especially looking at future land uses and potential, and also with the Safe Broadway Corridor project that's been happening just north of the downtown, bringing some of those principles within the downtown itself. This is a street that has more capacity in the design today than what is currently demanded in the volume of traffic that travels on it today. So it's another street that we're looking at taking those 4 lanes and converting to a 3-lane configuration to bring some safe design principles into the area while still sustaining the capacity and function of the street, and making sure there's more contiguous curb access for parking, loading, and also having better transit facilities up and down the street. On select blocks, there would probably also be some bike lanes. So you see here, this is a concept of some drawings we had at the public community workshop during the project. And so we would bring the bike lanes from the Safe Corridor project down Broadway to 3rd Street. So then they would fork over to Market and Topeka to keep going southbound because there's more room on those streets. On the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about next steps. So I wanted to recap the phasing and the sequencing aspects. So in the near term, we're looking at Market, Topeka, English, and Main. In the midterm, Waterman and Broadway, and ongoing, looking at and evaluating potential for rebuild of these prior striping and signal update projects. And then looking at some potential projects that have a lot of concepts coming out of this, but could require further study. So project by project on the next slide. What could this look like? I think, this plan cements the public vision that was developed over the years, working with stakeholders and at the number of meetings that Tia had mentioned. But there will also be continued opportunity for public input at various stages of implementation. As each of these goes from the concept and the vision that's in the plan, they have to go through design and engineering, corridor by corridor, project by project. And so with each one, there's a process of allocating and securing the funding. Some of that activity is already going on with the earmarking and the capital improvement plan. But as each project goes into design development, there'll be an opportunity for public comment. When it's going to be striped and signalized, there'll be an opportunity for public comment and refinement. And then subsequently, when there is further long-term implementation, each of these designs can be evaluated. How is it performing? How is it not? What needs to be tweaked and refined? There's an opportunity for public comment and feedback loop in the projects, and going into refining the design and getting it upgraded for higher quality materials, and looking at post-installation evaluation in the future. So each of these we see as like an ongoing process as they go from plan into design and engineering and implementation. So I'll pass it back to Tia to kind of summarize the ask from the group. We really appreciate your time hearing a recap of the project. There's of course also a web page where a lot of information from the project could be read in more detail. Thanks.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you for allowing us to be here today. Right now, we're not trying to put the cart in front of the horse, but in the current CIP, the 2023 to 2032 CIP, there are over $17 million allocated to downtown and the improvement thereof. So we're really at a decision point here. And I'd like to respectfully ask you, is this a plan that you think you could move to recommend Planning Commission recommends to City Council for adoption?
Okay.
And I'm happy to stand for questions too. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we'd like to have questions at this point. I'd like to lead off with, first of all, are you asking us to recommend approval of the detail on these streets that was presented in this plan?
We're asking, this is a conceptual level plan, and we're asking for general agreement about the content of this plan, meaning the roadway conversions and yeah, the general configuration of the streets.
But specifically these streets and what's covered in your presentation.
Yes,
I would like to have a copy of this before we take action so that we could all study it. But
okay.
my second question is, what is the reason for restriping these streets in the downtown area? Is it primarily to slow down traffic in the downtown area, or is it to allow bicycles and scooters to have their own private lanes?
It's more the first and less the latter.
That's what I thought.
Really downtown, particularly Broadway, is an unsafe corridor. We have a reasonably large homeless population and a lot of services along Broadway. And there are a lot of accidents. And we really, in my opinion, would benefit with downtown having more reliability in our street network for visitors so that they're not guessing which one is the one-way street and which direction they need to turn. And we have streets that are in one direction, and really the capacity is larger than it needs to be. You know, a 4-lane street, I believe it was Broadway, I'm going to pick on it. It has a capacity for 40,000 vehicles per day. The traffic on that is 15,000 vehicles per day. So we really can make a 2-way conversion on that street and not, you know, impact traffic. So I think the intention here really is about safety, and is about making the walking environment feel more comfortable to guests and people who work here.
Well, again, I would like to see a copy of the presentation to study.
Yes,
And also, since we're striping these streets for bicycles and scooters, I would like to see some data that shows the use of bicycles and scooters in these lanes before we take any action on this. With that, I'll open it up to anybody else's questions or comments.
may I answer the scooters and bicyclists question, if you don't mind? We had over 100,000 trips on bicycles and scooters last year. We do get routine scooter data. It's really, the bicyclists are maybe 10% of the population that travel these streets. The scooter people are 90% of the traffic that we have for the measured data. It is used, and the truth is the heat maps that the scooter companies provide us of where people are traveling, they're all over the place. I mean, it's hard to isolate them to particular corridors. I think with this plan, what we're trying to do is give them lanes and facilities, not on every street, but on almost every other street, so that we can narrow down some lanes on select streets like Market and have safer bike lanes so that the scooters will use them. I'm sorry.
Questions of the speaker?
Yes.
I have one.
Sure.
When you say that scooters are 90%, bikes are 10, is that out of all of their use?
That's
Is that what you
just
mean?
the bike share, and which is the white bicycles with the Blue Cross Blue Shield,
Mhm.
and the scooters, the rental things that
Yeah.
are downtown that
Okay.
people use. That's not necessarily every bicyclist who brings his bike downtown.
Are there any other comments?
The only comment I have is that she's looking for a recommendation from this group, and we're just one committee of this group. You know, if I agree with you, Bob, I think I'd like to have a little bit more.
I'd be willing to come back.
Well, but what I'm saying is that this has to go to move forward. You said for approval, it has to go to the full planning commission.
Yes, it does.
And we're just half of the planning commission or part of the planning commission. The only thing we can basically do is recommend that we saw it, we looked at it, and we recommend that we get copies of it so we can study it for all to come before the full planning.
I'd be
commission.
happy to send it to you today.
Well, I mean,
Mm.
not just us, but the full planning commission,
Yeah.
when you think.
Well, it will go to the planning commission, but they'd like your endorsement before it does that. So we'll get you more information and you can have another opportunity to vote up or down on whether to place it on their agenda.
Then I would take that to mean that we would want a motion to defer this until we get more information.
Well, I guess the question for me would be, do we want to go through it twice? If we move it forward to the full MAPC, then we can tear it apart. If we're going to tear it apart once and then have them tear it apart again, that's a lot of time and effort to do that. I would be comfortable.
We can do that.
Go ahead.
All we've seen on the data is what's presented today. We haven't had a chance to study all those facts. But that's fine. If that's the motion that somebody would like to make, we can send it to the MAPC and let them debate it.
I recall all the communication on this prior to the pandemic, and I think that's the sad part. We had a lot of information and demonstrations, and Tia's been here once before with a portion of the presentation. In my mind, if we got hard copies that we could have in our hands, recognizing the number of years that they've worked on this presentation, that the next step would be to see it at MAPC and let the full commission react to the plan at that time. That'd mean we'd have documents for at least 2 weeks, and they would too, if we could get it sent to everyone at the same time.
Yes, yes.
Would
So-
you accept
that
a
be a motion?
motion?
I would accept that, your motion. I would second it.
Yeah, so my motion
what's the
is that
motion?
we would request printed documents to the full MAPC and then recommend that the full MAPC react to those documents at a date to be named. Could it be the next meeting already or
Yeah,
the first?
It was
meeting
our
of
desire to have it on the 19th
Next.
of January.
January, so
Yes.
that it can hit the funding
Right.
cycle.
But we're not recommending approval of all the detail in this report at this point.
We're recommending that the full MAPC receive the documents printed for review and recommendation by the MAPC at its next meeting. That would be my motion.
I agree with everything except the next meeting. That, to me, the staff has been working on it, but I have a couple other things to do than. So, for 30 days, I would suggest if you're gonna do it to the full planning commission, because they're only gonna have a chance to see it, and they'll get their stuff a week before the next planning commission with all the other stuff that's already in line. That's all I'm saying.
Is there any other public meetings scheduled between now and
I've been to.
the first Thursday of
4 of the
February?
6 dabs. I'm doing 2 more dabs next Tuesday or Monday night. And then there's the planning commission. So that's more or less the capstone before it gets to the city council. And I'm not trying to rush this, and I'm not saying that the street configurations within this plan are final. I think there was a slide saying there's going to be a lot of public input as this moves into design.
Ms. Fox, would you accept the amendment that this would be deferred for 30 days to the planning commission?
Yes, I would accept that.
Okay, is there a second?
I second it.
Okay.
So do I understand it right? You don't want Tia back here on the 9th of February, which would be our next meeting. Okay? Without any recommendation from you all.
Passing it forward, we're saying that, there may be changes, we want for review, but I'm not gonna make changes at this point, and I don't want to go through the changes before I send it to them.
Sure.
I
All
think
right.
should be the full committee that takes a look at it.
All right.
Okay, then let's have a vote. We'll go with the voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joe.
At this point, we are going to skip ahead. We're running out of time, so we are going to defer item number 5 and item number 6. The reviews you should have a copy of, and you can look at that at your leisure. Is there any public comment at this point from anyone present? You have 3 minutes to speak if you want to make any comments. Just look at it at this point.
Yeah, that report is in your packet.
Right. Is there anyone virtually that would like to make comments at this time? If not, I will call on Mary again to introduce a new staff member.
Yes, I'm happy to introduce Momita Kundu. She just joined us effective December 27th, and she is an associate planner in advanced plans. So I want you to just welcome her because you're going to be seeing her every month at these meetings.
Thank you for making me a part of the team, and I'm honored to be here today. Thank you.
Welcome to the group.
Welcome.
With that, we will stand adjourned. Thank you.